So welcome to Kingston WritersFest, the online edition. My name is Ara McCauley. I'm the operations manager for the festival, and I'm very pleased to present the Robertson Davies lecture, Black Lives Matter. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we generate this online presentation is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these indigenous nations for their historical and ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We're grateful to those organizations and individuals who support the festival. For this event, Kingston Writers Fest would especially like to thank Judith Brown, author patron of Desmond Cole, and Florence Campbell, author patron of Anita Jack-Davies, our arts partner, Theatre Kingston. A very special thank you to event sponsor Jennifer Surridge, daughter of Robertson Davies, to the Canada Council, Heritage Canada, Ontario Arts Council, the City of Kingston, and Kingston Arts Council. Also, special thank you to Tourism Kingston for their marketing support. And thank you to all of those who have attended and donated to the festival. A little bit of housekeeping notes. This event is 45 minutes long and includes a brief question and answer period. You can tell us where you're from using the Zoom Q&A function, and you can also post your questions for Desmond there too. A reminder to complete our online survey for a chance to win a pass to next year's festival or a basket of books. And you can check our website for details on that. Our arts partner, Theatre Kingston, presents The Meeting, a powerful play featuring an all-star local cast about a fictional meeting between Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. This event opens September 30th and runs to October 18th at the Tet Center for the Creativity and Learning. And you can check theatrekingston.com for details. Now to the main event. I'll begin by introducing Anita Jack-Davies and then turn the event over to her. I'm indeed honored to introduce Dr. Anita Jack-Davies, an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Urban Planning at Queen's University, and the senior research advisor, Research Initiatives, Diversity and Inclusion for the Queen's Faculty of Education. Anita is an academic and cross-cultural expert, a writer, certified mediator, and a facilitator with over 20 years of expertise in training on workplace diversity and inclusion. As president and CEO of Mosaic Cross-Cultural Solutions, she provides inclusive curriculum development and strategic planning support to organizations in Canada, the US, and across the globe. An alumna of Kingston Writers Fest, she is the author of the forthcoming memoir, Laurencia's Last Parang, a memoir on loss and belonging as a Black woman in Canada. Please welcome Anita Jack-Davies.
Thank you. Thank you, Ara, and thank you to the organizers of this event. So happy to be here and so happy that I have the esteemed privilege of speaking with Desmond Cole tonight for this lecture. Desmond Cole is a journalist, activist, and author. He has spent the last 10 years reporting and commenting on politics and social justice. He is especially interested in the struggle for Black liberation within Canada. Desmond's work includes 10 years of local and national news coverage, 5 years of radio broadcasting at News Talk 1010, a disruptive opinion column with the Toronto Star, and an award-winning magazine feature. He is the author of the #1 best-selling book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. So welcome, Desmond.
Thank you very much, Anita. It's very, very nice to be with you. Thank you to Era. Thank you to Kingston Writers Festival. I'm going to begin this evening with a reading from my book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power. The book is divided by chapters based on the months of the year 2017. And so every chapter of the book represents a month of that year in order from January on. I'm going to be reading from the September chapter today, and that chapter is called Uncontrolled Movement. Now, that title refers to a couple of things within the chapter, but the section that I'm going to read from has to do with immigration. And the title Uncontrolled Movement definitely refers to this idea of Black immigration to Canada as being a sort of movement which our government really feels like it needs to strictly regulate and control, because there's some kind of threat to white settler Canada of simply allowing Black people to cross the border here or fly and land here as they choose. That idea that that process is unregulated is seen as deeply threatening to Canada, and always has been, even before there was a Canada, when it was British North America, Upper Canada, Lower Canada, etc. So I want to read from the September chapter and talk a little bit about a woman who was facing deportation in September of 2017, named Beverly Brom, and some context behind why her deportation was such a big deal for our Canadian government and why they fought so hard to try and remove her. Very early in the morning on September 19, 2017, I was one of several dozen demonstrators who filled the intersection of Yonge and Bloor streets in downtown Toronto, stopping traffic to hold a press conference in the street. Yonge and Bloor is generally a miserable place, with endless construction, stunted trees, aggressive security guards, and inhospitable corners with almost nowhere to sit or linger. There are lots of places I'd rather be than Yonge and Bloor at 8 a.m. on a weekday, but this was an emergency. We stood side by side at the four edges of the intersection with our arms outstretched to block traffic. Some of us were holding signs that read, "Let Beverly Stay," and "Black Family Matters." Beverly Brom, who was 38 at the time, was at risk of being deported and separated from her family for the second time in 7 months. And we were once again fighting for her to get permanent resident status in Canada. Beverly was married to a Canadian citizen, and the government was in the middle of processing her husband's application to sponsor her. Despite this, she had given birth to a son only 4 months earlier. Despite this, the government had plans to deport Beverly within 48 hours to separate her from her family by force. The Canada Border Services Agency, or CBSA, was after Beverly because she had overstayed the 6-month visa that she had used to enter the country from Jamaica in 2012. The government also suggested Beverly's relationship with her husband wasn't genuine. In Canada, we spend small fortunes to monitor individuals like Beverly, to subject them to deportation processes that can last months or years. We often keep people without status in detention, and in some cases, we house them in the same maximum security prisons as convicted criminals, even when they haven't been accused of a criminal offense. In January 2017, after the US administration announced its intention to ban immigrants from 7 Muslim-majority countries, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tweeted, quote, "To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. Hashtag welcome to Canada," end of quote. 1 year later, Trudeau's government increased targets for deportation by 25 to 35% and boosted the budget of CBSA in order, as Public Safety Ralph Minister Goodale put it, to pick up the pace of removals. A 2016 University of Toronto report titled "No Child Left Behind: A Roadmap to End Immigration Detention of Children and Family Separation" outlined Canada's practice of detaining children. The report's summary states that, quote, "Over the past several years, Canada has held hundreds of children in immigration detention. These include children from Syria and other war-torn regions, as well as children with Canadian citizenship who are not formally detained, but live in detention facilities with their parent or parents as de facto detainees. Some children are held in solitary confinement. Children who live in detention for even brief periods experience significant psychological harm that often persists long after they are released. End of quote. As reported by the National Post in the summer of 2019, quote, the CBSA also says it is now prioritizing the removal of irregular asylum seekers whose claims have been denied, as it does people who are deemed threats to national security or who are involved in organized crime, crimes against humanity, or other types of criminal activity, end of quote. Unlike the United States, Canada has no limit on the amount of time people can be kept in immigration detention, and it keeps many of those whom it cannot deport in jails indefinitely, alongside people convicted of criminal offenses. Since 2000, at least 16 people have died while in immigration detention in Canada. What does Canada get back for this investment in border agents, costly deportations, and immigration detention? I think we're buying into an anti-Black notion of national security, in which we understand that although immigration can be good, the unregulated entry of Black immigrants poses a specific and dire threat to Canada. For as long as Canada has been a country, it has gone to great lengths to keep Black people out and to deport thousands who arrive. The point is never to keep all Black people out, but to control us through the constant reminder that we are only here because the state allows us to be here. Deportations, immigration detention, and draconian border police are a signal to Black immigrants that we are still not here as free people. In Canada, we stay ignorant or silent about the conditions of Black life many centuries ago. So we don't have to think about the legacy of white supremacy and anti-Blackness that has been passed down to us through our government, laws, traditions, and social norms. Rarely do we mention that for over 2 centuries on this land before Canada was a thing, beginning in the late 1620s, British and French colonists brought thousands of enslaved Africans here to work for them. Africans came to this land as commodities, as property who could be bought and sold by white colonizers, including white French settlers who came to New France. From the Canadian Encyclopedia, quote, the earliest written evidence of enslaved Africans in New France is the recorded sale of a boy from either Madagascar or Guinea, believed to be at least 6 years old. In 1629, the child was brought to New France by the Kirke brothers, who were British traders. The boy was first sold to a French clerk named Le Belif. When Le Belif left the country, the little boy was given to Guillaume Couillard, who sent the boy to school. In 1633, the enslaved boy was baptized and given the name Olivier Lejeune. End of quote. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that. I'd like to pick up on something that you had mentioned. You had mentioned that Prime Minister Trudeau said, Canada welcomes you and diversity is our strength. Yet throughout your book, you talk about the ways in which Black life in Canada is marginalized and surveyed, and the ways in which we are policed, for lack of a better term. Why is it so difficult for Canadians to come to terms with issues of race and racism in Canada as opposed to the United States?
Well, I think that Canada defines itself through negation.
Mm-hmm.
So Canadian identity, with such a powerful neighbor to the south, our identity is mostly based on the idea that we're not the United States. So it's through negation that we identify ourselves. And what that means is that we don't have to contend with our own history. We don't even have to contend with the things that we do today. As long as we can convince ourselves that we are not as bad or as wicked or as racist as the United States, then we don't actually have to grapple with who we are and what we do. But I think the other reason that Canadians don't want to contend with the anti-Blackness and the white supremacy in this country is because it doesn't benefit white Canada to do that. People really like to classify racism, Anita, as some kind of, interpersonal issue, as some kind of personal prejudice within inside the individual, that they are ignorant and they haven't been educated, they didn't read enough, they weren't taught enough, they grew up not around people of color or Black people, so they just don't know any better. All these ideas, none of which are true. The truth is that when you live in a white settler country and you want to keep all of the riches and advantages in the white settler country, it is to your benefit to subject other people to racism, to push them out of the employment sphere, to push them out of school, to arrest them and put them in jail, to police their immigration, as was with Beverly in the chapter that the part of the chapter I just read. White people benefit from white supremacy and racism. It's not just individuals being mean or ignorant or saying a nasty word to somebody. When we fail, others succeed in our place. And that is why Canada looks the way that it does. That's why our employment system does. That's why our politics and our corporate leadership, all of it looks the way that it does. The wealth gap in Canada looks the way that it does on purpose, because white majorities benefit from the racism.
I can see, and I take your point, I can see individuals who have tuned in tonight being really uncomfortable with the term white supremacy. Growing up as a Black Canadian, that is not a term I was sort of introduced to until I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. In what ways do you think we need to be rethinking ideas around white supremacy, for example?
Well, I know that when white people hear that term, they think of something very far away from themselves, right? When white people hear that terminology, they probably think of the Ku Klux Klan, the Nazi regime, of the Third Reich, and other such, entities, explicitly racist, we want to annihilate other groups kind of philosophy. That was the philosophy of Sir John A. Macdonald, who founded this country and who has statues and roads and buildings named after him too. He was explicitly white supremacist, John A. Macdonald and the so-called founding fathers of Canada. I hate that term. And by the way, when I talk about the difference between the US and Canada, that's how lazy we are with our history, is that the United States says founding fathers and we just adopt that terminology and then say founding fathers of Canada. It's very lazy. But John A. Macdonald and his political contemporaries had debates in the 1880s about who should be allowed to vote in an election in Canada. And they were very explicit about the exact reasons why they didn't feel like Chinese people were fit to vote, why Indian people, East Indian people I'm talking about, were fit to vote. Those people were fit to come here and build railroads and do hard labor and then be sent back home again. But they were not fit in John A. Macdonald's eyes to actually be citizens and to vote. John A. Macdonald compared Indigenous peoples to what he called sons of the soil, meaning almost that they were animals, right? That they didn't have the same humanness to participate in society as the white British people did. And so this is the white supremacy that founded our country. And the idea within that of Black people voting was absolutely ludicrous in that time. And so I think that when you really, but that's still a long time ago, right? That's still 1880s, early time of Canada. But I mean, why do we still pledge allegiance to the Queen and put her on our money? Why do we still call ourselves part of the Commonwealth? Why is it that all of the legal and formal traditions of Canada are based on the same white supremacist, white settler ideology if we are not those people anymore. So Canadians want to separate themselves. And when you really then contextualize things in history, people will say, well, I am not a white supremacist, which really is a kind of meaningless statement if you live in a white supremacist society and don't fight against all of its vestiges, traditions, and racist practices. If you're not doing anything but declaring yourself a good person inside of a white supremacist structure, that doesn't scare it and that doesn't change it. And so I think Canadians don't want to have to do the work that many of us Black people are doing every day to try and disrupt and dismantle white supremacy. They want to stay out of it and say, well, I'm not involved in that. I'm a good person. And of course, that neutrality, that false neutrality, holds us back. Bishop Desmond Tutu said that if you are neutral in a situation of injustice, then you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And I think that's a really important idea.
I want to touch on something that you mentioned earlier between Canada and the United States. Something that my friends and acquaintances have often said to me is, as a Black person, I would rather be in the United States than in Canada, because the racism that I experience in the United States, at least I know it's coming. At least I know how to respond. At least I can sort of anticipate it. But in Canada, the racism they describe as polite or as something that you can't plan for, which can be quite unsettling. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all heard this as Black Canadians at one point or another, that seeming like contrast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what comes to mind when I hear that is, first of all, if you've actually experienced like overt racism, if you've had somebody call you the N-word, if you've been told that your hair was the wrong type and was too messy for you to look professional on the job, you know, if you've been subjected to these just blatant acts of racism,
yes,
you know, PK Subban or other players like having monkey taunts or having bananas thrown on the ice at them, are people really saying that that's like better because you know it's coming? Like, that is so violent and disgusting. And nobody wants to experience that, right? But I think the other thing that's interesting about it is that it's this idea that there are tiers of racism.
Okay.
And instead of dismantling white supremacy, what we should be doing is arguing about which is better or which is worse kinds of racism, when really, you know, there isn't any kind of like racism light. Like, it's all the same thing. It all comes from the same ideology. And it is absolutely an insidious kind of racism that is in Canada. But I mean, if we just look at what happened recently with Breonna Taylor, murdered in her own house by the police in Louisville, Kentucky, and it takes 6 months for them to decide that they're not going to charge the officers that murdered Breonna Taylor. And then there are people rioting in the streets. 2 police officers in Louisville are shot and somebody immediately arrested. So it took them a couple of hours to arrest somebody who shot police, and it took them 174 days to not arrest and charge anybody for murdering Breonna Taylor. And that's the blatant racism that people are telling us is better. So I don't know what to tell you. It's all destructive. It's all killing us. There isn't time for us to argue if we're being serious about which form of racism is better or worse. That's a distraction.
I could see Canadians pushing back and saying, Desmond, what are you talking about? After the George Floyd murder and then in this post-George Floyd moment, I have pledged, I have given money, I have shown my support. What more do we need to do?
And white supremacy. I mean, that's what the point of the protesting and the demonstrating and the risking our lives to be outside during a pandemic, that's what it's about. It's not about some kind of material, like incremental gain that liberal people, when I say liberal, I mean small L liberal, liberal-minded people can pat themselves on the back that they moved the needle forward a little bit, and the next generation will take care of the rest. We're literally fighting for our lives. And so as a country, let me take my own city of Toronto here. So people recognized that the George Floyd murder was wrong, and George Floyd was even named in a motion at Toronto City Council after he was murdered. As a result of his murder, the Toronto Police Force received an increase in its budget, for body cameras. So when I was a child, Rodney King was beaten on camera, and the whole world saw that, and that was almost 30 years ago.
Right.
So we've come from Rodney King being viewed all over the world, being assaulted by police officers who are not held to account for that, by the way, to now saying 30 years later, maybe if somebody catches them on camera, they'll be held to account for it.
Okay.
You literally just watched George Floyd be murdered on camera. What's not clicking here for people, right? Like people were standing, forget about a camera that can't do anything, that is not a person, that can't intervene. People were standing there screaming at the police officers, you're gonna kill him, you're gonna strangle him, stop it. Is there anything more powerful in that moment than other human beings observing and witnessing and saying, no, this is wrong? But we want to delude ourselves because we don't want to dismantle the structure of policing. We want to give policing every chance in the world, and Black people, if they kill you, well, maybe we'll find it on the video camera afterwards, and maybe we'll sort it out. So this idea that we're doing something by giving the police more toys, giving the police more money. Justin Trudeau just had the Governor General deliver his throne speech. There was absolutely nothing of substance in there about dismantling our police forces and giving their money to the communities who they have terrorized, Black and Indigenous communities primarily in this country. So people can feel really great about their personal epiphany in the last few months after George Floyd's murder. That's not going to save me, and that's not going to save our communities.
Desmond, I could see people squirming and feeling very uncomfortable and saying, defund the police, excuse me. What about my safety? What about my security? What happens then? What does that look like? This idea is, for lack of a better term, absurd. What would this actually look like in real life?
So one of my kind of thought leaders in this issue is Mariame Kaba. And I really encourage people, if you don't know who Mariame Kaba is, to read her work. She just wrote a piece that she released today where she says that, not only can we not imagine a world without the police, but we're disciplined into being afraid to even try to imagine the world. I would ask people who say that that is an absurd idea, are the police keeping you safe? Because they are not keeping us safe.
Okay.
And that's the whole point of policing, is that policing is not a universal service. Policing keeps some people safe at the expense of other people. The police in my city here and in Kingston and in every city in Canada where people live outside as a result of homelessness, which is literally every city in Canada, the police are used to clear homeless people who have nothing and who are not being supported by their society out of sight so that no one has to see them. How is that for their safety? The money used to police them could be giving them housing, mental health supports, addiction supports.
Okay.
But we don't use that for their safety. We say that the safety has to come for the people who are afraid of them. Policing is an oppositional service. It is not a universal service. So for those of you who feel that the police are protecting you, I ask you, at whose expense do you feel safe? Because policing was designed, as I say in my book, and as I cite Robin Maynard, who talked about this in her book, her excellent book, Policing Black Lives. If we go back to the 80s, 1790s in a place like Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
White people owned slaves, enslaved Black and Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
And they were often really worried that enslaved people would try to run away. And so they would have a deal with newspapers where if somebody tried to run away from a plantation or a property, they would tell the newspapers, and the newspapers would print up these big slave notices, runaway slave. And this is what they look like. This is what they were last wearing, their height, their weight. And every time, if you find this person and return them to their owner, you will receive a reward, because there must be benefits to white people, as I said before, for engaging in this white supremacist behavior. And so that is exactly where our ideas of modern policing in Canada come from. Just as during the Red River Rebellion, people know about Louis Riel, they created a pass law system when Métis people were rebelling against the crown and said, you can't leave your properties. You can't leave these reserves that we have forced you onto. And if you do, you have to show your papers. This is where the RCMP and our local modern police forces come from, because white settlers were not being policed in this way. And so people are asking us in this modern time to just reform that institution, just tweak it a little bit. But it was never designed to keep everyone safe. It was always designed to keep some people safe at the expense of others. So if we want a system that truly keeps people safe, we need something other than policing. And I'll just add this, Anita. The complete violence of the system that we now say is a safety system is a system that sends armed men to do so-called wellness checks on people like Chantal Moore in New Brunswick and murders her. Rodney Levy in mental health crisis, murdered by the police in New Brunswick. Regis Korchinski-Paquette having a dispute with her family here in Toronto. The police rush into her home, threaten obviously her in a way where she didn't feel safe, and she tries to escape from them and falls off of a balcony and dies. DeAndre Campbell, a young man, 26 years old in Peel region in Brampton, Ontario, calls 911 for help for himself. He lived with schizophrenia. He said, I'm not feeling well. The police came into his home and murdered him. This is the safety system that people are saying that we can't live without. And it has caused such irrationality that people believe that going to a mental health crisis with a gun and lethal force is called safety. It is not called safety. There is a lot of racism behind that notion that that is safety that we need to continue to challenge.
I wanted to pick up on the examples that you just gave, because I think for many of the examples that you provided, I don't know if the average Canadian could even recount those stories, but we are we are able to talk about George Floyd. What do you make of this, this dichotomy, this distance?
We consume a lot of US media in this country, myself included. Our airwaves are dominated by US content. But there's a couple of things here. Number one, watching somebody lose their life in a video the way that many people watched George Floyd is like, it's so grotesque that I can't even begin to describe it. I wasn't able to watch that video. I chose not to, because I don't want to take in that kind of violence. But I also object to the idea that it is important for people to take in that level of violence as some kind of learning experience, that our bodies and that the murder of us for white people to witness is some kind of teaching tool for the future. But yeah, to your point, if you're a Canadian and you're saying that watching George Floyd be murdered was somehow a learning experience for you, you can't even say the names of DeAndre Campbell, Aisha Hudson, a 16-year-old girl murdered by the police because they said she stole alcohol from a store. Like, these are people who are being killed in your own country. Jamal Francique was killed at the beginning of the year while sitting in a car. He was shot in the back of the head by a Peel Regional police officer who remains unnamed. Another feature, by the way, of these killer systems is that the police in Canada who do all of these acts remain anonymous. Very often in the United States, if you want to compare it, we often find out the names of officers who have committed these crimes, even if they are never criminally charged. Their information is released. Body camera footage is immediately released. I don't support body cameras, but I have no belief in this country that the police are going to willingly hand over that information. Why would they when they won't even tell us the names of the officers doing the shooting? So if you can't say the names of people who have been murdered by the police in this country, I ask what you're learning of George Floyd, how deep it really goes, if you can't fight for people whose names you haven't even learned. And I would also say that, of course, the sensational is a form of entertainment for a lot of people, sadly. Being able to witness somebody being murdered is unfortunately the kind of violence that Cydia Hartman refers to as like these scenes of subjection, which have an effect of kind of reinforcing the racism that people say that they're claiming to try and like undo by watching. Just watching that kind of thing and sharing it over and over and playing it over and over as if there's no sacredness to that person's life. That in and of itself robs Black people again of our humanity, but those are the people who are murdered. The vast majority of police violence in this country is not murder. It is surveillance, it is carding, it is arrests, beatings, strip searches. It is jail that is disproportionate to the crime. It is 3 times as many Black people in federal prison as there are in the there are in the general population. 5 times as many Indigenous people in jail as there are in the general population. Most of it isn't murder. So if the only thing that can get people to say that they've had an aha moment is literally our death, that is not good enough, because we can't bring people back with our too late recognition that they shouldn't have died. We have to be proactive, and that's why we have to abolish the police, because everything short of that just says, we'll let it happen again and try to sort it out afterwards. And when people say Black Lives Matter, they mean that our lives have to matter while we're still alive.
2 things, and Ara, please let us know how much time we have, because I can talk to Desmond all night. I watched the video. I felt as a Black Canadian that I needed to see that video, and that video has changed my life because I saw someone pleading for his life, and that plead went nowhere. I want to talk to you and to ask you about why Black pain is unrecognizable.
I think that goes back to what you were saying earlier about why we don't want to engage with the notion of white supremacy. If people were to experience a little slice of any pain that we feel, if they were to be able to recognize it, then you become entangled in that pain. And you may even feel a responsibility to do something about it.
Okay.
So again, I don't think it's in people's benefit to recognize the pain that we experience as Black people. It's not in the white majority's interest, certainly, to recognize that pain, because then they would have to do something about it. And what that actually means is people will do weird things in order to classify our pain as not pain.
Okay.
They will do things to classify our subjugation as not subjugation. One of the stories I tell in my book is about a 6-year-old girl who was handcuffed in a Mississauga school in late 2016. 2 police officers came into her classroom after the school called the police on this 6-year-old, 48-pound Black girl and basically said that she was having a tantrum. The police actually responded to this call. Of all the things that they could have done that day, they decided to come to the school and they shackled this girl. They chained her up by her ankles and her wrists with their handcuffs. It was a really horrific story, but I think that the thing that was worse for me, which I document in the book, was the way that the media responded. And the way that this like white male media industry in Canada just kept saying when they were talking about this story in commentary, well, what were the police supposed to do? They had no choice. They had no other options available to them. So what you're saying is that this assault and traumatizing of a girl is not really assault and trauma. It's just normal policing. It's just normal police work. Because if you were to really have to connect and contemplate with what that girl went through and is still going through with her mom and her family, that's painful. And it's hard to sit with that. And in many ways, that's what we're trying to ask non-Black people who say that they want to connect with our movement. We're asking them to sit with that pain, to not try and reclassify it or immediately say, oh, I get it, I understand. Sit with that pain because we have no choice but to sit with that pain. And it is through the recognition of what we're going through that people can come, I think, to a more human place. But of course, they know what that pain would feel like if it was happening to them. So they don't have to extrapolate too far. It's not an experience that people can't understand if they don't want to.
Okay. I would like to ask you two questions. The first question is about the example that you just gave, because in the book, you had mentioned that some reporters or disc jockeys were saying, well, obviously, if the school had to call the police, there must be something wrong in the home. There must be something wrong with this child. Any comment about that kind of sort of response to a situation that was obviously wrong, for lack of a better term?
I love your use here of the term disc jockeys, because having been on AM radio for 5 years, that is the culture. It's shock jocks. It's just a lot of angry white men who don't know a whole bunch about the topics that they are reporting on or commenting on from day to day, but whose main function is just to express anger or resentment or just to have a chauvinistic macho attitude. I mean, what can we really say about people who don't want to recognize a crime against a 6-year-old child? They want us to go down into the weeds with them, and I'm afraid to do so. I just think that those of us who understand that something like that is wrong and harmful need to do so. There are other ways as well. I mean, like I think of like the child welfare system, which I talk a lot about in my book as well. There are more Indigenous children in the child welfare system in Canada today than there were Indigenous children at the height of residential schools. But again, we have switched from acknowledging that that was done at the beginning on purpose to intentionally erase Indigenous children's culture and language and separate them from their family. And today we pretend, just like the police, that the child welfare system is a system of care, that separating people from their families is care. And I just think we need to have the courage not to debate our humanity with people who don't want to see it. People who want to engage in public conversation where they say that separating children from their families is a best practice, putting cops in schools, putting handguns in the hallways is a best practice. We need to not argue and engage with those people, but to say, never mind. Maybe one day you'll understand or you'll acknowledge what harm you're doing right now. But those of us who understand better, we are enough. And we need to reinforce and strengthen, I believe, Anita, one another instead of wasting our precious energy always on trying to respond to ignorance and trying to respond to reactionary critics who, quite frankly, they'll go tomorrow and talk about another topic as if this never happened. They don't care. So we have to be very careful ourselves about how much we want to engage those attitudes.
Sure. I want to sort of switch the script a tiny bit to talk about Black communities for a moment. After George Floyd happened, I heard a lot of members of the Black community say this is, you know, unfortunately, he had to give up his life, but, you know, institutions are giving, you know, lots of money, and, you know, they're making all these claims about anti-Black racism, and there are new initiatives to create new programs and help, you know, quote unquote inner city students. And I'm wondering if you have a message for our community at this time.
Keep your focus would be my message to our communities. Keep your focus. If your focus and your intentions were sharpened by the police murdering somebody, then our first priority is to make it impossible for the police to murder somebody in the future.
Okay.
Like, we have to keep our focus. I didn't ask for a youth mentorship program because George Floyd was murdered. I don't hear anyone actually asking for that. Those are concessions that white institutions and white corporations are giving to us, hoping that we will forget that that's not what we were asking for, that we were asking for an end to policing. And I think that there is no greater sign about this than all of the hand wringing in the United States in particular about property destruction. These corporations want to give a youth mentorship program. Jeff Bezos wants to start a child care center, I saw today, for low-income people.
Right.
But they want the police to protect their business when Black people are out in the streets, because their business is more important than our lives. So they can give the concession on the one hand, hoping that the police will continue to protect them at our expense. And that's not what we asked for. So people will tell us that things like police abolition are impossible. If police abolition is impossible, then so is Black liberation. And I'm not going to accept that premise. We must liberate ourselves. We must continue the liberation process that our ancestors have been ongoing with for hundreds of years. And that requires a lot of sacrifices. So we as Black people must continue saying the things that others don't necessarily want to hear or are afraid of, because, for example, it is through our advocacy that a lot of the civil rights that all Canadians enjoy today were even brought into place. And when we were advocating to change immigration laws in this country, because don't make any mistake, people give Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, or sorry, other Trudeau, his dad, it's hard to forget when everybody in the same family keeps getting power. It's really hard to remember, but Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he gets the credit for some reason as being the person who brought forward immigration. But it's people like the women I talk about in my book who came here as domestic workers from the Caribbean in the 1950s, were subjected to disgusting medical examinations, were not allowed to sponsor their family members, right? They were the ones who fought for those policies to be changed. And then a white prime minister gets the credit. But when they opened those immigration changes, it was for all kinds of people from all over the world. People would have told you in the 40s and the 50s, when Black women couldn't even be nurses in Canada, for example, that opening up the immigration system for them to be allowed to bring in their families was impossible. They did it anyway. They fought for it anyway. When people wanted to restrict immigration to Canada on the basis of HIV, because they said that that would be too dangerous for our country. That was mainly a targeting of Black people, of African people. And we fought against those rulings to say that you shouldn't have your immigration status affected by HIV. People would have said at the beginning of that fight in the 80s that that's impossible. But Black people are always pushing for the impossible until it happens. And then history is recaptured from us so that a white leader or a group of leaders can take credit. We must continue to do the hard work, even if we're not going to get the recognition, in service of generations to come. You know, indigenous people in this country in different traditions often talk about 7 generations and trying to act in service of 7 generations into the future. That is the kind of thinking that we need.
I want to talk about this idea of self-care within Black communities. often when we talk about mental health, even though we are individuals who are often dealing and coping with quite a bit, we're not exactly the poster children, quote unquote, poster children for mental health. Any thoughts on that and what we need to do to ensure that we are taking care of ourselves?
Well, my own personal struggle is an anti-capitalist struggle in, the best tradition of so many Black freedom fighters who have come before us.
Okay.
Capitalism is the problem. And capitalism tells you that if you are ailing from fighting against its excesses, that you should buy some candles and do some aromatherapy. You should go pay for a personal massage.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us don't have the resources to do that because we can't even keep food on the table or put a roof over our heads.
Okay.
And so I think we actually have to challenge the notion of self-care,
Mm-hmm.
and we need to be taking care of one another. I've seen the most incredible initiatives
Mm-hmm.
being put into place during coronavirus. People who are cooking and providing meals for
Mm-hmm.
their neighbors, or cycling and biking those meals across the city so
Mm-hmm.
that people can eat. People who are opening up abandoned spaces so that people who don't have shelter can have it. This is a form of community care. And I think that for those who can afford to and have the luxury of taking care of themselves, of course they should do that. But that is not a reality for everyone. And those who need the most support often don't have the means to provide it for themselves.
Okay.
So we shouldn't individualize the notion of care.
Okay.
I think capitalism really encourages us to do that. Instead, we should be thinking about the ways that we are reaching out and supporting people to ensure that we are caring with and for them.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop or pause here because I see that we have at least 12 questions for Q&A. And so, Ara, would you like to either pose the question or I can read the question? I'll just give Desmond a moment to take a drink and I will do the same. Yeah.
Sure. So I can read a couple of these here.
Great. Thank
I
you.
want to thank our audience too. Obviously, we've gone over, but I know that this conversation, I mean, it could go on for so much longer, but we don't want to just stop it here. And as Anita said, we do have some questions here. So the first one is from Juliana. And she says, "Hi there, my name is Juliana, and I am a 20-year-old student at Brock University here in Ontario, Canada, studying education. I am currently reading The Skin We're In, and I am so grateful to be able to understand more about this anti-racism movement. The book does an incredible job at conveying really powerful messages. My question would be, as a future educator, what advice could Mr. Cole offer in order for me to make a more inclusive environment for my future students?"
Mm-hmm. It's Juliana who asked the question, right?
Yes, it is.
Thank you so much for that question, Juliana. I would say, that it's really important to be honest. And some of that honesty has to do with using the language that others don't want to use because they think that it's too forceful. They think that it's too controversial. So, when Anita was asking earlier about white supremacy, racism does not spring out of the earth or fall from the sky. We have racism the way that it exists today because of colonialism, because of the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and the attempt by white Europeans to colonize the entire planet, huge portions of which still belong to them today. And so why can't we be honest and use the words, say white supremacy, and don't teach only about some ancient past of white supremacy and fossilize what is still real today. I'll give you an example. I shared something today on social media that I think everybody should have a look at. In a a piece of territory near Caledonia in Ontario right now. There is an ongoing land dispute. A development company wants to build homes there, and this territory is the territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And those people did not give their permission for this development, for this development to happen. And they continue to fight back against the development, the government, and everybody else who wants to push them further off of their territory. Now, why do I bring this up? Because last night or the night before, the local county police services board released a letter in which they call members of the Six Nations of the Grand River terrorists for trying to resist on their own land. If you're a teacher in Ontario, don't talk to me about white supremacy back then. Go read that document and teach that to your students. Because do you know something? The Indigenous students in your class, if they're there, they might think, I'm really glad someone's telling us about this today. If they happen to be Mohawk, they might even have a closer connection. Haudenosaunee people are the ones in that part of Ontario who are resisting. So this brings people's lived reality and their ancestry into play in the classroom. It doesn't make it abstract. Teach the history, but also teach what's going on right now and use the right words so that your students don't grow up feeling ashamed or afraid to name what's happening in their country.
Another question here. This is from Susan in Brantford. She said, thank you for sharing the skin we're in. It has driven home how much more I need to learn and pay attention to what's happening in Canada. In my workplace, there are over 100 individuals who are currently reading and learning from your book in a grassroots book club. Can you suggest additional books that we could continue to learn from? What book are you reading right now?
It's always a really nice question, but there's just like, there's so many. So a place to start would be, and not everything is a book, by the way. Robin Maynard, whose book you must read, Policing Black Lives, amazing book. So that's one. She talked in a talk about how she was doing her research for her book and she found all these like master's students' thesis. And a master's student who's doing something that they might think is obscure, they put their thesis together, they submit it, and they think, well, no one's ever going to read that. It's not true. We're reading it. We're using it and we're citing it in our books. So, I mean, if you think that my book is useful, you may want to go to the index and see who I cited in my book. And that can be like a good starting place for other ideas of who to read. But I mean, I would recommend, among other people, works by Ronaldo Walcott, Idil Abdullahi, L. Jones. Not all of these are books, by the way. People write articles, people write poetry, Dion Brand. I would read Saidiya Hartman. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I'll say this about the question itself. There isn't a catch-all for learning about Blackness, because like, if you're really interested in like Black voguing culture, for example, like I can't recommend something for you because I don't know nothing about that, but like, it depends what you want. Do you want to know about Black people's dance culture? Do you want to know about the sleeping car porters who worked in the segregated situations in Black Canada? Do you want to know about Black education or Black literature? Do you want to know about Black slang? It's endless. The exploration of our lives is not confined to struggles politically for stopping police violence or stopping white supremacy. Like, Blackness is rich and Blackness is full. So do what you do with anything. Pick a subject of interest to you and then research it. That would be my recommendation to you. And if my book is of interest, the index of my book that tells you where I got my citations from is a good place to start. I also think you should read Anita Jack-Davies' forthcoming book as well, obviously.
Thanks, Desmond.
I think just being mindful of the time now, thank you again for being so generous with your conversation. But Anita, if you had any last words before I do the formal wrap up.
Yes, I wanted to thank you, Desmond, for your writing. I read your book, and there's so much that I know that I still need to learn. Thank you for your bravery, and thank you for standing up when the invitation is to remain silent. And I wish you continued success as your book is read by more and more Canadians and people around the globe. And it was a real honor for me to have this chat with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you. It's been a pleasure meeting you and
Thank
getting
you.
to, like, talk with you a little bit about preparing for this talk. And I really appreciate you conducting this conversation. And please, everybody, buy the book 2021, but we'll keep reminding you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Era.
Well, once again, thank you to you both for this conversation. To say it gives us a lot to think about is an understatement. And we're very grateful to have you both with your ideas and your commentary and your exhortations joining us here tonight, because this is obviously an issue that is timely and is essential and is not going away. This is a reminder. I know that everyone's going to want to run out and do this now. So copies of Desmond's book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, are available for purchase now at Novel Idea Books.
Yeah.
You can pick those up. They are open. They also are accepting orders by phone or online, or you can find them at your local independent bookseller. A thank you to Novel Idea, a thank you to Doubleday Canada, and thank you to you, our audience, for joining us and for supporting Kingston Writers Fest. Be sure to check our website for other wonderful author events. Stay safe and stay well, and good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.